The year was 1799, and in the fertile lands of Fauquier County, Virginia, a child named George Willison Adams was born into a world defined by contradiction. The youngest of 13, he entered a home of privilege and pain, where slavery was as woven into the family estate as the tobacco fields that blanketed their land. Yet, within the Adams household, a shift was stirring. His father, George Beale Adams, had grown increasingly troubled by the system that enriched them. He'd sit long hours on the porch, staring at the horizon, muttering thoughts only the wind could hear. The stories go that he found no rest in profit, tainted with suffering. Then, in 1808, he made a decision that stunned neighbors and drew the ire of Southern society. He freed every enslaved person he owned, sold his lands, and moved his entire family to the anti-slavery North. Settling in the still rugged terrain of Madison Township, Ohio, there, young George was raised among simpler farms, abolitionist ideals, and the harsh winters of the frontier. His father, now an outcast among his former peers, found a strange peace-tilling Ohio soil and speaking at anti-slavery gatherings. George absorbed his father's fervor, witnessing firsthand the price of conviction. By the time he was a young man, George had inherited more than just land. He inherited a mission. Prosperity followed him. He and his brother Edward built a successful flour mill in Trinway. But unlike many businessmen of the era, George saw wealth not as an end, but a means. His mill became more than a commercial hub. It became a gateway, a lifeline, a hiding place. Beneath the sacks of grain and behind false walls, men, women, and children passed quietly in the night, whispering prayers of escape. Trinway's citizens knew him as a generous, civic-minded man. What many did not know was the quiet war he fought every day, beneath floorboards and behind shuttered windows. But George dreamed bigger. He imagined a house that would not only shelter his family, but shield the hunted. A place of grandeur and cunning, built not only with bricks and timber, but with purpose. That house would rise in 1856. Its name, Prospect Place. And though the world would see only a mansion, behind its walls a far deeper story waited to unfold. The ground in Trinway, Ohio, was cold that spring of 1856, but George Willison Adams stood firm on the plot where his vision would rise. With sleeves rolled up and eyes set forward, he oversaw every measurement, every stone placed, every beam raised. This wasn't just a house. It was a message. The locals marveled at its ambition, a 29-room mansion in the middle of a modest rural town. Built in Italianate and Greek Revival styles, the house rose like something meant for politicians and titans of the East, not for a flour miller in the quiet folds of Ohio. But George wasn't building for admiration. He was building for purpose. He insisted on architectural features that puzzled the masons: extra thick walls, oddly shaped chimneys, and narrow alcoves that didn't quite make sense. In the basement, plans shifted without explanation. Walls shifted inward. Tunnels veered off sharply. What no one knew was that George had consulted not only architects, but freedom conductors, men and women of the Underground Railroad who knew what it meant to hide in plain sight. Behind one wall, he requested a hidden compartment just large enough to fit 2 adults curled tight. Under the kitchen, a passageway was carved, sloping downward into a dirt-floored chamber lit only by a narrow shaft of light. The cupola, designed for aesthetics, was rigged as a signaling tower, able to flash lanterns in codes that only select conductors understood. It was a fortress of secrets, masked in wealth. While townspeople walked its halls, marveling at the polished wood and grand staircases, few knew that the very foundation of the house was designed not to impress, but to protect. At night, George often stood alone in the cupola, looking out over the Muskingum River, watching shadows move like whispers through the trees. He kept maps in his study, marked with safe houses, patrol routes, and coded names. His children knew not to ask questions when the cellar door stayed bolted or when strange men arrived with stories that didn't match their clothes. Then came the knock one midnight, a sharp, hesitant rap on the back door. It was the beginning of the first real test, a test not just of courage, but of the house itself. And from that night on, the mansion would never truly sleep again. The knock echoed softly through the back halls of Prospect Place, barely louder than the ticking of the long case clock in the foyer. George Adams, already awake and dressed in dark wool, opened the servant's door without lighting a lamp. Outside stood two figures cloaked in mud and fear. The man, tall, gaunt, with torn sleeves and blistered feet, held the hand of a girl no older than 10. Her eyes were wide and empty, the look of someone who'd seen more of the world than any child should. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. George gave a slight nod and stepped aside. They passed through the kitchen like ghosts, silent and swift, guided by routine George knew too well. Down through the stone steps into the basement, past crates of dried goods, past barrels marked for trade, then behind a narrow cabinet, pushed aside with effort, revealing the entrance to a hidden cavity beneath the house. The space wasn't comfortable. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to save lives. Once the man and child were safely inside, George slid the cabinet back, sealing them in darkness. He returned upstairs, quiet as a shadow. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the town was stirring with tension. A bounty hunter had arrived, riding a gray horse with eyes as cold as its rider's stare. The man introduced himself at the general store as Mr. Bram. He bore a worn leather book filled with descriptions and names. Rumor had it he had tracked fugitives from Tennessee to this very county. George met him face to face on Main Street. A courteous exchange, a shared nod, a test of eyes. Bram mentioned he was looking for a man and a girl, said he had a good lead, said he might like to look around. George smiled with practiced calm. "You're welcome to admire my home from the outside, but unless you carry the governor's writ, my doors remain closed." Bram didn't smile back. That night, George gathered his children in the parlor and played the piano, louder than usual. A familiar song, cheerful, masking any sounds from beneath the floorboards. His wife brought out sweet bread. Laughter filled the rooms like armor. Down below, the girl wept silently in her father's arms. Hours passed, then days. Bram lingered, watching the house from a distance like a hawk above a still field. Then, without warning, he vanished, and with him, the storm. George waited one more night. At the appointed hour, lanterns flickered twice from the cupola. A conductor appeared at the tree line, no name, just a gesture. The hidden panel opened again. The man and child stepped out, pale and shaken, but safe. George didn't ask their story. He only whispered, "You're almost there." And just like that, the house exhaled. But not for long. For every safe soul sent north, more would come behind, and soon the walls of Prospect Place would hold even darker secrets. Prospect Place stood tall in the light of summer, its white columns gleaming against the Ohio sky. But it was not the sun that gave the mansion its weight. It was the burden it bore in silence. By 1858, the house had seen dozens pass through its hidden spaces, mothers clutching newborns, brothers with bullet wounds, teenagers barely old enough to understand the cost of their flight. All came with hope. All left behind fear. And George Adams remembered every face. He had grown more cautious. Patrols were increasing. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had turned neighbors into spies, and suspicion traveled faster than news. Whispers crept through the town about late-night visitors, about music played too loud, about wagons that rolled in full but left empty before dawn. George heard them all. He said nothing. But the walls? They were starting to speak. It was his youngest daughter, Lila, who first mentioned the sounds. A tapping beneath the parlor floor, a breath when no one was there, footsteps where there were no shoes. At first, George dismissed it. His children were curious, imaginative. They lived in a house filled with tension, with secrets. But when his wife Margaret admitted hearing the same things, at different times in different rooms, his mind returned to every person they had sheltered, every story unfinished. Then came the night he awoke in a sweat, not from a dream, but from the sound of chains, rattling, dragging, close. He followed it to the grand staircase, candle in hand. There was nothing, no wind, no footsteps, but the floor was wet, just a few drops, like tears. Still, he said nothing. He couldn't afford to, not to his family, not to himself. But the silence began to break in other ways. One evening, while preparing a shipment of flour from the mill, George found a note tucked under the axle of his cart. Just 7 words. "You are watched. Choose your guests wisely." There was no signature, no name, just fear. He burned the note in the fireplace, but the ash stuck to his fingers. For the first time, he hesitated before unlocking the cellar door for the next travelers. 2 young men, one limping, the other mute. Their eyes begged, but George's heart wrestled with the weight of that warning. Still, he let them in. That night, a lantern moved at the edge of the woods, not in signal, but in surveillance. George didn't sleep. By dawn, the men were gone, guided north. But so was the family dog. Disappeared. A message? A warning? No one spoke about it. Instead, George reinforced the tunnel in the basement, installed a new panel, gave his eldest son a pistol, because the house was no longer just a sanctuary. It was becoming something else entirely. A stage, a target, a story the walls were still writing, even when no one was speaking. By 1859, the tension surrounding Prospect Place had thickened into something unspoken, heavier than fog, sharper than frost. George Willison Adams continued his work, steady in the eyes of his community, respected as a businessman, a philanthropist, and a gentleman of vision. But behind his composed exterior, he was unraveling. The house had grown too quiet in the daylight and too restless after dark. The creaks in the floorboards, once ordinary, now carried rhythm. The tapping in the walls became more precise. 3 beats, then silence, then 3 again, always 3. George no longer dismissed it. One stormy October evening, a knock came again. This time, not from the back door, but the front. No one knocked there. George answered it himself. The man who stood beneath the porch light wore a black coat, stiff with road dust, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He carried no bag, offered no name, but he spoke clearly. "I need shelter for 3 nights. I won't stay longer." George hesitated, more from instinct than logic. "You're not one of them?" he asked carefully. "No," the man replied, "but I've helped more than you know. I'm being followed. I just need 3 nights." There was something in the man's voice, calm but clipped, like someone used to silence and solitude. George allowed him in. The stranger didn't eat much, didn't speak to the children, and didn't sleep in the guest room. Instead, he asked to stay in the attic. George agreed. Something told him this man preferred heights, where he could see everything below. By the second night, things began to change. Margaret awoke to the sound of the piano playing itself, softly, slowly, one broken key repeating a single note. But when she entered the parlor, the lid was shut. On the third night, the stranger came downstairs after midnight, his coat already on. "They're coming," he said simply. George didn't ask who. He only moved. Together, they doused all lamps. He woke his sons, told them to lock the cellar, then stood by the kitchen window. Moments later, hooves thundered down Main Street. Not riders, marchers, 5 men, lanterns swinging, rifles on their backs. They didn't stop at the mill. They came straight for the house. George stood at the threshold, waiting, heart steady. The stranger disappeared into the attic, rifle in hand. When the men reached the front steps, George opened the door before they knocked. A voice barked, "We have reason to believe you're harboring fugitives. Step aside." George held up a letter from the county sheriff, a friend, clearing him of all suspicion. The men didn't care. They tried to enter, and then a gunshot, not at them, above them, a warning shot, fired from the attic window, just one. The message was clear. You step inside, you might not step out. The men froze, weighed their options, then cursed under their breath and retreated, muttering threats. George closed the door quietly behind them. When he climbed the stairs to the attic, the stranger was gone. No footprints, no farewell, just an open window and 3 dusty footprints on the ledge. That night, George didn't speak to anyone. He simply sat in his study, quill in hand, writing a new entry in his hidden journal. The walls are watching, the house remembers, and so do I. Years passed. Seasons cycled through the windows of Prospect Place, painting the columns with snow, pollen, and rain. The Civil War exploded across the nation, and freedom, once whispered through hidden doors, was shouted across battlefields. By the time emancipation became law, George Willison Adams had already grown old. His beard had grayed, his posture softened, but his eyes, those same clear, watchful eyes, remained sharp. He had kept no medals, no public praise. He never stood before crowds to boast of the lives saved inside his mansion's walls. It wasn't pride that drove him. It was purpose, quiet, unshakable purpose. Prospect Place, now just called the House by many in town, stood tall, weathered, but proud. Its bricks had been shaped by more than mortar. They held secrets. The very walls seemed to hum with history, though no one could quite place why. George rarely spoke of those days. Even to his grandchildren, he offered only fragments. A story about a stormy night, a tale of a traveler with no name, a warning that not all houses sleep. The children giggled at his ghostly tone, unaware that he was not trying to frighten them, but to protect them. Then, one quiet winter morning, George did not rise. Margaret found him seated in the study, head resting gently on his ledger, a half-written sentence trailing off mid-thought. He died as he lived, watching, writing, remembering. The family mourned, but life, as it always does, moved forward. Generations passed through Prospect Place. Rooms were repainted, carpets changed, but no one dared seal the basement door, no one boarded the attic, because strange things lingered. The floorboard still creaked when no one walked. Cold drafts slid from walls too thick for wind. Visitors heard soft weeping in empty rooms. Children playing in the parlor claimed to see a man in the cupola watching. Word spread. People began to talk, not just about the architecture, but the energy. Ghost hunters arrived with gadgets. Tourists came seeking spirits. Television crews filmed shadowy corners. They spoke of hauntings, of mysteries, of curses. But those who knew the truth smiled gently, because the house was not cursed. It was faithful, faithful to its purpose, to the lives it once saved, to the man who built it not as a monument to himself, but as a shield to the voiceless. Prospect Place was not haunted by fear, it was guarded by memory. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, you might still hear a faint knock at the back door, not of a ghost, but of a traveler, searching for freedom,